Everyone, I'd like to thank you in joining the continuing series of Champions Power of Choice webinars, this session on data governance, data management, and compliance. Hosting the event today will be myself, Rob Kirkwood. I'm the Director of Data Governance for Champion Solutions Group. And with that, we can get started. So, let's take a look at our agenda today. What we're going to cover is introductions and give a little explanation of the depth and breadth of Champion Solutions and where the data governance falls in our practice. We're going to take a look at the focus on value and return on investment. Like anyone who's gone out and bought a car or a major appliance or even software or services, we all in some manner act like CFOs and immediately turn to that back page and we want to see what that price is. Not really sure exactly what we're getting yet, but we want to know what that price is. So let's address the value and the return on investment of the entire solution set before we even get started, so we can set the foundation for what we're going to be looking at. Then we're going to explore the actual business issues that are currently going on across industries with the exploding growth of data management and security concerns that we read about constantly in all the various trade magazines as well as the Wall Street Journal and news. Then we're going to actually focus on the solution processes that Champion Solutions has developed in order to try to help these business issues and again provide value and return on investment, of which we'll do a wrap-up and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. So, Champion at a glance. As you can see, Champion in its 30-year history has spent a great deal of time in developing various different services and offerings throughout the business community. We've got virtualization and cloud computing, which of course we're looking at all best and next practices within the industry. We've got our data management and security area, of which I focus on the integrated data management of structured information. Of course, our professional services supporting all our products and solutions, our maintenance consulting services, and then of course assistance in IT procurement services. So, in regard to the integrated data management, we basically focus on 4 pillars. We've got the data governance, which is a new solution set and practice within the Champion family. We look at controlling data growth and the explosion of that growth. We focus on protecting your information and the data governance and compliance around that. And then, of course, as time goes on, we all look at application retirement and moving on to other platforms and other different systems. And we need to focus on how we look at retiring those applications in the least cost manner. So, focusing on the value and the return on investment. When we look at this area, we need to understand what the value is that we're getting out of the solution. So, where is the value derived from when we're talking about data governance, data controls, data management? Overall infrastructure cost reduction has value. When we have the opportunity to be able to take an organization and reduce their infrastructure, reduce their footprint, whether it be processors, whether it be storage, whether it be retasking of resources committed to doing these things, backup systems not having to grow and grow. That has value in reducing the infrastructure of organizations. And as we all know, the infrastructure cost goes directly to the bottom line of organizations and affects their P&L. So therefore, if we can help reduce that infrastructure cost, we are of course benefiting and helping the bottom line of an organization. Risk mitigation has value. We look even in the insurance organizations of today. They focus tremendously on this. Risk mitigation. Too much information can hurt organizations. Too much information getting out of your organization to other different facilities can hurt that organization. we need to focus on methodologies and understanding of how we mitigate those risks. The retasking of resources has value as well. If we can provide process-based and tool-based solutions that help take day-to-day or week-to-week type of manual tasks that have the exposure of possibly being missed or mistakes, and we put them into process and automated scheduling type of functionality, those resources can then be retasked to do other things that may be more important on the priority list, thereby being able to do a little bit more with the same or just a little bit less. That has true value. And then, of course, the performance of applications has value. When we look at the service level agreements, or SLAs, between the IT organization of a company and the business line side of the organization, performance is always key. Information needs to be accessible as quickly as possible for people to make decisions while on the phone, while dealing with situations. And if we can stabilize and guarantee that the level of performance of applications will remain a constant, even though we're looking at an ever-growing data growth or having to worry about transposing information for security reasons, that has value. And now, when we take a look at all of those things, we talk about value. Well, tangible versus intangible items can all have value. But the real true measure is if that value or investment has the return that you need within your organization to make it feasible. And of course, we understand that in today's business world, that type of justification is demanded across the board by all C-level and all stockholders and business line owners. And when we take a look at that as far as ROI, and that's thrown around a great deal. I once, in dealing with a colleague within the industry, the statement was made that if we could make that I really small, then boy, that R would grow a lot bigger. So our goal is going to be that we're going to try to demonstrate that a small investment can bring a large return when looking at these processes and tools on the short-term as well as a long-term basis for putting a data governance plan or an information lifecycle plan into your organization, either in full or in different pieces depending upon where those business requirements or pains might be within your organization. So, with that, let's take a look at the business issue. And we focus on simply Newton's third law. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So what's happening? My applications, my data, the data is growing. We're continually growing. More and more information is being put into our enterprise systems because we need more and more information to make powerful, intelligent decisions with that information to move our business forward. So what happens? If that's the action, our reaction is of course going to be applications beginning to perform slowly. The resulting effects, SLAs may be missed, the customer satisfaction declines, statements are always heard, why does everything take so long? Okay? You've got the situation with backups. Backups seem to take forever, or they continually grow as a function of what goes on within your data administration and your growth of that data. Batch jobs running into working hours. Well, we all know as that data increases and some of these legacy type systems have to churn through massive amounts of information to get from point A to point Z, that there's going to be a timing issue. And sometimes those nighttime windows start to run into daytime and affect the organization's performance, or the inability to provide that application data in the morning for the organization. And then, of course, with that comes increased infrastructure and storage costs. The statement being made, every time I turn around, we are buying more storage. Some organizations have 5- and 7-year plans laid out already about all the increased storage they need to buy due to their expected growth in production, thereby their testing and development environments, and this is an ever-occurring buy. Well, we want to try to look and see if there's a way we can change that philosophy to make sense, provide value, and provide, of course, the return on investment, which allows you not to have to go through that type of buying cycle. Example here, in total relation to what we were just discussing, is this simple chart demonstrates that over the course of time in a business's life, the hardware is sized for the applications and the data expected. But then, of course, as it grows, the information and the data explodes within the organization. Well, what occurs? Performance begins to suffer, as demonstrated by the chart. Well, the knee-jerk reaction or the industry reaction for the last 15 years has been, we need to increase processors. We need to add more storage. We need to add more arms on the devices in order to access that data quicker. Well, that is a temporary resolution. If you extend this chart over a long time, this is exactly what most organizations do. And in doing so, they have to continually buy, to continually invest, and then as well, the subsequent pieces that go along with that, like backup systems and duplication systems, as well as co-location systems, all have a direct impact on this increasing cost. And as well, with that cost comes the ever-growing risk that goes along with keeping track of all of that data. Well, what if there was a way that we could potentially look at this and try to flatten out this chart and begin to maintain a very constant and capable level of performance while continually moving information off production systems and keeping just what was required and not having to do constant buying of storage and processor facilities in order to maintain that growth. So, let's take a look at the business data itself and the exposure of that information. We talked a little bit about the growth. Now let's take a look at the fact that all of this enterprise information that you've been collecting over years and years and continue to do so has exposure ramifications. We look and say, there's clones of production being used for test and development. Well, the classic example, of course, over the course of years has been that how do we create our test environments? How do we create our development environments? Recently, I pulled a number of organizations, and of course, 99% of them came back saying, we take a backup of production, and we restore it back in as test. We restore it back in as development. We create it 2 or 3 times as development. We get it off-site, maybe it's last month's, maybe we clone it from last night's backup and hold the backup a little longer. This is exposed information within the system. Okay? Why do we need so much data in these environments? Why are we exposing complete production environments into our testing and development systems? We should really be looking at better ways to address this. And of course, going back to the data itself, if we're doing this type of cloning, then of course with your increase in your production systems, the same philosophy will have to hold true with your test and development at an X factor of how many environments you're keeping along the side. Another point in that exposed data is we don't want to be in violation of compliance. Of course, compliance gets thrown around as a word left and right: financial compliance, healthcare compliance, financial compliance within a private organization. We need to look at some of that information, and we want to make sure that in a compliance manner, we of course don't want to violate any government regulations as far as data. We don't want to have information leaked out within the organization, and we certainly don't want to be a headline. And then of course, when we look at that information and we think about all of those copies being out there, we've got the lingering copies of critical information. Well, what happens? Production is made into testing. Some people from testing say, you know, I'm going to take this offline and do a little testing on my own. I may bring it into Excel or Access or some low RDBMS to do some offline. Well, now over the course of time and that occurring in development, your production data, whether it is current or whether it's from a year ago's worth of information, it is still proprietary production information, and now it's been disseminated down onto laptops, desktops, perhaps offshored, outsourced, and who can keep track or who can honestly guarantee that these data sets haven't leaked and become just out there on various platforms? And then, of course, how do we ensure that that customer data, employee data, and the trade secrets, are remain protected? Some people focus on just the fact that there's sales information. Well, of course, there's employee data, there's customer information. Organizations may be doing new financial modeling to see if a new business plan or a merger acquisition might be good for their organization. All of those models and such might be within their application systems within that data. And we need to ensure that that data isn't, of course, cloned, copied, tested, and perhaps, brought down to another platform. We need to focus on that exposure. Now, further to that, there was a recent article in CIO Insight that polled thousands of people within organizations at the business level as well as the IT level. And regarding that exposure, 49% of employees would look at confidential information that they weren't supposed to have access to. 49%. So 50% of the organization almost has inadvertently looked at information that they shouldn't have access to within the organization. 33% said they would alert their management. So 66, 2/3 of those people who may have looked at that data would never mention that they had access now to that data. It's a staggering, staggering figure. 27% said they would take customer data, including contact information, when leaving an organization. And of course, in most cases, these individuals are moving within the same industry. In, I'm sure, some cases, they're moving towards competitors of existing organizations that they've worked for. And to think that 27% of them, a little more than a fourth, are taking that customer information that they can get their hands on and moving it along with them to another position. 23% said they would take electronic files when leaving a position. So almost a fourth said they would actually gather electronic files to take with them. So therefore, the whole concept of this exposure of data and the amount of production and test data that we leave out on our enterprise systems has a very, very large impact on what can happen within the organization when people are moving around, testing, leaving the organization, or coming into the organization. And then 46% said that the recent economic times was not a factor in why they were acting in this way, which basically said didn't matter whether our economy was on a high or a low, they were still going to try to take this information with them if they had their hands on it. That's a huge exposure from an enterprise information focus point. So, in moving on, let's take a look at some of the other issues that we look at when we're talking about our data governance. Redundant systems acquired via mergers and acquisitions. Huge data explosion. Banking industry, most recently, we've seen larger banks gobbling up smaller banks. All of these systems in certain cases are redundant. They're working on the same type of systems because they're in the same industry. So we've got redundant systems from M&A activities, and that, again, relates back to our infrastructure costs. How do we look at that data, and how do we focus on removing redundant systems? A line of business may have been divested, sold off a division of an organization. You read the journal, you see different business lines of large organizations are constantly being diverse and sold off. So what do we do with that production information? Now, financially speaking, that data needs to be kept for however many years reporting is required, both externally and internally in the organization and government-wise. But yet, should that data truly be sitting in production environments, taking up all of that space, being copied for testing environments? Should it be part of the backup plan? It's inherently part of the DR plan. We should really look at how to remove that information properly and not have it part of our going forward production set. Legacy technologies not being compatible with our IT direction. So in a lot of cases, organizations have to keep these technologies and the data supporting that because there's nothing they can do with them in moving forward. Well, although we may focus and talk mostly about the application, the underlying data is truly the most important piece of that equation. So how do we address taking that information and moving it along, or making a archived version of it which allows us to keep it in an immutable format and not worry about any sort of transposition it may go through when moving into the new IT direction? And the required technical skills and application knowledge. In a number of cases, we run into, we've got data sets and applications and there's just no one around anymore that's there to support them. Yet this thing needs to sit in the corner and continue to run. Well, that's another area that we need to look at from a data management perspective, and how we can take that data, keep it in its formatting, and perhaps move it to some form of a lower cost platform or another IT platform within that production mix that's going to allow for a smaller, more effective infrastructure while not having to worry about having skills and technologies that are very difficult to find. And then, of course, budget pressures, doing more with less. If we can reduce that production footprint or reduce the amount of legacy systems we have to try to manage, okay, there's no question that from a budget performance perspective, we're not going to have resources dedicated to that. And again, as we spoke earlier, they can be retasked, and we don't have to worry about those types of systems, as well as introducing those systems into your backup and recovery type planning. And then, of course, having to keep legacy applications alive due to their data retention. You've got systems that are running, they're in the corner, they can't be shut off because the data needs to be there, because there's a retention compliance. Let's see how we can focus on taking that information, removing what I'll refer to as the entourage, which is, of course, the hardware, the licensing, the database licensing, the service component, support of all of that, is the entourage all around keeping that data. Let's lose the entourage, and let's just focus on how we keep the data. So, what I've done is I've touched upon a number of different areas that are pain points within the industry and within business in controlling data growth, in testing concepts, in privacy concepts, and just general business moving forward. So, again, when we go back to talking about value, it's a very simple math equation. It doesn't need to be complicated, although our enterprise systems may be very complicated. The solution set is not. We have our business issues. We need to apply a data management solution set that makes sense, and from that we're going to create value. And hopefully when we demonstrate that value, the necessary ROI is going to be demonstrated as well. So with that, what I'd like to do now is let's switch gears and not necessarily talk about the pains, the pressures, and the issues, but focus on some of the areas that we see as the solution set to some of these areas going forward. For instance, smart archiving of information. Utilizing champion methodologies and IBM tool sets, we can create smart archiving whereby the information we can extract within your organization, in your enterprise system, is a smart archive that contains the right information based upon the right set of business rules created by yourselves in order to archive and thereby reduce the size and set of production. And we'll look more into that. The management of test and development environments. As I spoke before, if the classic example of taking production, making copies of it, and calling it test and development, well, you're constantly X plus in all your storage concerns and considerations. Let's focus on how we can manage better those test and development environments. And of course, we talked about the sensitive information. Well, let's think about the de-identification process of that sensitive information. Let's focus on how we can create the right data sets for testing or development and de-identify it to the point where it has no value on the street or to anyone else, but yet still retains its value in being valid information for testing and development. And then, of course, as we just spoke of a little bit ago, it's time for retirement. Let's focus on some of our solutions and processes that we see best fit organizations in how to retire certain applications and, of course, the data sets within those applications. And then, at a more macro level, a business level, let's focus on how we can put a hardened security shell around our entire data enterprise, not just at our transaction set level, which is what we've been talking about, but how can we on an overall basis put a shell around that and secure our information to make sure that these smaller copies, even if it's de-identified, aren't being passed off and sent somewhere, or information is being looked at, as we noticed in the CIO Insight survey, by people who shouldn't be looking at that information. So, our first piece, the smart archiving of information. If we take a look at the classical enterprise information data set, we're going to see that our current information, of course, is always going to be a smaller data set than all of the history that may have been built up in our tables. So, from an archiving perspective, let's take that historical information based upon the business rules and requirements of the organization, and let's place it in archives. Still available and accessible to the organization and the applications, but not in our production systems. And with that, using our methodologies and tools, take the reference data that goes along with that historical information. The example or understanding would be that if I've got information or sales history about customers or employee transaction data sets, then my referential data is, of course, the customer master information or the employee master information or the vendor master information or the loan applicant information. And let's take that data model information along with our historical data. So if we were to take that archive and move it off onto another platform or to another system or to back into the production in a testing environment, we would have all the necessary requirements for a fully functional data set and not just transactions. And in doing so, what we refer to this as the complete business object. Everything necessary to reconstruct a complete transaction set that makes sense within the data model. Let's take a look at our management, our test and development environments. When we take a look at this, of course, getting back to our statement, our classic production and production clone. We take that, we make our copies. And what do? We make a copy in development. We make testing copies. We make all these various copies. Q&A, training environments, everything based upon production. So as we spoke of, there's risk associated, sensitive data as well as the large data growth. How do we address these? Well, let's talk about right sizing. Okay? And how do we get there? Here's our perfect example. We've got a production data set in the red and all the various environments that we just spoke of. And for our example purposes here, we're going to say that our production environment is a small 500 gig enterprise data set. So therefore, if we're making these copies for our various entities, we've got our training, our unit testing, and so on and so forth, and now we're looking at a total of 3 terabytes. Not including, of course, any co-location or DR plan that might go along with that. That would, of course, double that to 6 terabytes. Well, if we employ our smart archiving solution set and tools and just focus on doing the right type of archiving of production, we can drop that down to 200 gigabytes. A 60% reduction in storage requirement. That alone, from a value perspective going forward and an ROI perspective, easily justifies itself just in focusing on the archiving. But here we're talking more about the testing and development environments. So, here we are down to our 1.2 terabytes. We then turn around and say, well, let's focus on right-sizing those environments by providing just the right data sets needed for training and for unit testing and for integration. If a company's been in business for 35, 40 years, perhaps has 15 or 20 years of historical data in production, selling 250 different products, and we're trying to introduce a new product line via testing, why do we need to keep that much history for us to test that simple one product line we're trying to move in? Or in a development case where I'm developing new applications, why do I need all the product lines, all the employee information, all the loan applicants? Why can't I just have the last 2 months of coordinated data, or 1 year of one business lines versus information to focus on in doing that type of testing? I don't need all that information. And of course, you would be the one, when your business requirements, defining what these type of data sets would be. So if we employ our right sizing of our testing environments, we now go back and say, well, our production system may be 200 gig, but I've got training and unit testing now at 25 gig apiece. And because I've created these right-sized environments, the refresh rate can be almost instantaneous. And we know, of course, that during testing and development, especially in the case of development, developers break data. That's part of how they create and guarantee their applications. And testers run through the information and make changes via applications in trying to work with these applications or development models. And we need the capability of doing very quick refreshes in development and test in order to be able to make corrections, as well as in doing these very quick refreshes on smaller data sets, we of course bring the timeline down in getting your product to market, which equates directly to labor time, costs, delivery, which has an expense, which has value, which means we can focus on an ROI of being able to shorten project life cycles because we're not constantly waiting on test and development data to be constantly refreshed in some manner from a production set. And when we try to pull those things together, you'll see that in this perfect example, we now are at an 83% reduction in storage requirements, just using general archiving technology rules and employing some right sizing of our testing and development environments. So now let's focus for a moment going forward on our third set, which is our de-identification set. We spoke earlier about the sensitive data. We spoke about the testing environments. Well, now let's focus on when we take this information from production and we create our testing and development right-sized environments. Let's use some de-identification tools and methodologies to take that information and when creating our test and development, de-identify the information. Change customer names, change customer numbers, change addressing information, change values, unit costs of products, sales figures, financial numbers. By doing so, we de-identify it, we make it a valueless commodity if it in fact does get to laptops or into Excel, into someone else's hands. Yet, from the focus of using that information for testing or for development, it's still valid information and can serve as very valuable in going through that cycle to get back to production with your applications. Yet, the data itself in those testing and development environments have no true value because you've de-identified them. The example, of course, that we use is the Social Security number that might be in a transaction or in a master record within your system. We start with Jason Michaels, but by the time that information is de-identified through the tool sets and passed off into your testing and development environment, it's become Robert Smith with a totally randomized type of Social Security number. And of course, the tools that we work with within IBM have various and wide ranges of functionality in order to be able to create Social Security numbers, arithmetic operations, string calculations, and a number of other different types of formats and tools in creating that de-identification for you. And then, of course, our fourth area that we focus on is it's time for retirement. So what happens? We need to remove a system and its hardware from active service. The data has value. Remember, we spoke earlier, we need to remove the entourage. We need to get rid of that hardware, the licensing, the cost of operation, the resources involved, even the electricity to run these systems. So let's look at our methodologies and tool sets which allow you to extract that information or archive it in an immutable format which can't be touched, and then have it accessible or transportable to some form of a lower cost platform or database that you can still connect your BI tools to, your reporting tools to, and not worry that for the length of time it needs to be kept, you're never going to worry about it being adjusted, changed, but yet you've got that information, but you don't have the entourage that goes along with it in the form of all the hardware and licensing and operating system that you've got to carry from the previous legacy system. And then, of course, retaining the access to that business critical data. You may have links into that data model for BI solutions, for feeding forecasting models. Well, by extracting that data model using the archiving tools, you can maintain that data model on a different platform, lower cost, same cost, but still have its connectivity to business critical information or applications that need to see that data. And again, knowing that no one can touch that data and make corrections to it or changes based upon how it was in its legacy system, thereby satisfying auditors' e-discovery requirements or financial requirements over the course of time that the data has to be kept. Another issue, consolidating retirement systems and redundancy. You may have cases where across your network you've got multiple iterations of the same type of applications and systems. You're moving on to something else. And now what do? Do we have to keep that hardware, software, and applications 10 times over for the 10 divisions that are still running that? Let's focus on an enterprise standard whereby we can archive that information off those legacy systems into a standardized data model that's probably from the legacy app. Focus that in archives and have a central or decentralized way of accessing that legacy information, but yet being able to remove all the hardware, software, and support around those redundant systems that we want to retire. And then, of course, we want to migrate the portfolio to a lower cost platform. This is definitely a key area where we can create value and demonstrate the ROI. There's no reason why, when going through that retirement process, where normally customers say, you know, we need to keep this running, it's an expensive database platform, it's an expensive hardware operating cost, but I need that information, I need to be able to get at it. Well, we look at our retirement methodology and our processes, And we take that information and we focus on how to archive it down to a lower cost platform, maintain the model of the data, still accessible to all your other feeds of different systems, and thereby reducing your cost of operation or your TCO regarding all of that information. And then, of course, consolidations and eliminations of unsupported databases and versions. By archiving that type of legacy data and keeping it in an immutable format, as you migrate up to other formats of databases where the new versions may have effect on the databases themselves, you can be assured that you've kept that database or that information in an immutable format that no one can touch, no system can break, that if you needed to go back to that and see how it looked in that second or third year back, or fifth or whatever, you can go back, focus on that data, and know exactly what it looked like, not what it's been transposed to on these newer database and version platforms. And then, of course, the overall focus, reducing that infrastructure and operational complexity. Going back to some of those core values we spoke of in the beginning. We want to help try to reduce that infrastructure cost, thereby affecting the bottom line in a very positive manner, and taking out the operational complexity of all of these systems having to be carried. And when we branch out and you look at this on a macro level, and you think about having these systems, the redundancy of these systems, DR plans that need to include these systems because the data still needs to be available, your DR plans, your risk of recovery within your DR plan becomes very risky. Well, let's get rid of that risk, and let's focus on how we can keep our core production systems at the lowest liability possible, but yet get as much value out of the historical data as we can. And as I brought up, the disaster recovery window requirements. Let's focus on how we can shorten that and not have to worry about all the various pieces that need to plug in. And then, of course, from a compliance perspective, which we always have to keep in the back of our minds, how do we keep it so that we refer to the immutable format of that information? So from a compliance perspective, an audit perspective, an e-discovery perspective, we can guarantee within our organization that we've kept a format of that data in its data model or in another form of its data model in a manner which it can be looked upon and guaranteed that no one is capable of touching it, altering it, or transposing it into something else when it needs to be the exact image of what that information was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And of course, we could go on and on about how the different various entities of retirement have an effect, but the focus mainly, of course, in this session is what do we do with that legacy data? How do we maintain it and keep its value, and be able to demonstrate an ROI in removing some of the support around that legacy data? So, the shell. When we spoke earlier about the shell around our enterprise, our focus here is our circle of improvement when we're looking at security and that shell, because it's an ever-going focus. People create new databases, new applications. Therefore, this can't be something that's set in place and then just left in the corner. It starts with auditing and reporting, looking at the information that's out there, assessing and hardening based upon what we see in these audits reports to create a more tighter shell and understanding of what's going on our enterprise. We need to find and constantly classify as DBAs and organizations and M&As occur, new databases and new platforms are integrated into your enterprise network. We need to make sure that these aren't left out of the shell and become entry points for internal as well as external hacking, as well as just information leaking out of your enterprise. And then the continual monitoring and enforcing of that information through this shell, whereby our tools and our processes allow the continual monitoring of that information to guarantee that you've put the right type of audit and security around your enterprise. So, with that, we'll take a look at our solution recap. So, we spoke about smart archiving in taking production information, archiving it, reducing the risk of our DR plan, getting a stability within our production environment and not having to actually continually make buys and buys and buys on processor and storage. We took a look at test data management, and right-sizing your environments. Again, reduction of storage, being able to recover iterations of those testing environments much quicker so that we can shorten the project model and have consistent testing controls, whereby the testing group, the development group, and the QA group are looking at the same exact data set, refreshed from the same exact clone, so the checkoff process can run a lot smoother. We talked about data privacy and de-identification methodologies that allow us to create the compliance requirements we need, HIPAA in the healthcare, outsourcing of testing and development environments where we don't have to worry about the data that's being passed over the network to our third-party providers. And then we spoke of retirement and what we need to do with our legacy applications, reducing that cost. M&A occurrences where one system is going to be chosen over the other, so instantaneously what may have been production a year ago is now the application that needs to be focused from a retirement perspective. And these are the 4 areas within the transactional data management that we focus on. And with that, just want to wrap up and make sure that we covered the areas we said we would today in our session. We gave an introduction of Champion Solutions Group and the depth and breadth at which we cover over the 30-year history of our organization and our newest practice within data management, data governance. Our focus on the value and the return on investment, I think we demonstrated to the extent that we understand that it has to be value, but yet we need to be able to as well help demonstrate to you that there's a return on that investment of that value. We explored just the tip of the iceberg in regard to the business issues that plague the industry in the explosion of data and enterprise information that you as an organization are carrying and constantly increasing and plugging into new and different BI tools and applications within your organization in order to move your organization forward. And then we talked briefly about various solution processes that Champion employs to help solve these business issues. So with that, what I'd like to do is we have about 10 minutes left, which I hope is enough time, and I hope this gave you a good understanding of Champion's focus and how we'd like to assist you in the resolution of these business issues.